And that's after the news now on BBC One with Martin Lewis. It's 9:45.
Lord Owen in Moscow says the world must find more money and troops for Bosnia, as his peace plan appears to be rejected on the battlefield and in the ballot box. And Rebecca Stevens is on the last leg of her bid to become the first British woman to climb Everest. Good evening. Russia has given its full backing to the Owen-Vance peace plan for the former Yugoslavia, saying it should be implemented regardless of the outcome of today's referendum in Bosnia. As polls closed, it appeared that the plan had been firmly rejected by the Bosnian Serbs. The peace negotiators, Lord Owen and Thorvald Stoltenberg, who are in Moscow for talks, say the world must contribute further resources to stop the fighting.
At a government guest house in Moscow, the Russians were keen to tell the international mediators about new proposals for the prompt implementation of the Vance-Owen peace plan. Mr. Kozyrev told Lord Owen and Thorvald Stoltenberg that Russia would present its proposals to the UN Security Council next Friday, regardless of the outcome of the Bosnian Serbs' referendum.
We don't have to wait for every last Bosnian fighter to approve the Vance-Owen plan. We can start putting out the fire in the former Yugoslavia gradually.
The Russian plan envisaged containing the flames by sending in international monitors to seal off Bosnia's borders and then extinguishing local fires by strengthening UN peacekeeping efforts in the Muslim safe havens. Mr. Kozyrev said Russia itself was willing to contribute personnel to the effort. Lord Owen welcomed the Russian initiative because otherwise the Serbs might see the peacekeeping forces as pro-Western.
We don't want the majority of the forces to come from the United States or indeed even Western Europe. We need a balance of forces, and that does require contributions from the Russian Federation.
Until recently, President Yeltsin had felt under some constraint from hardline Russian nationalists who support the Serbs. But now that most Serbian leaders themselves have given their backing to the Vance-Owen peace plan, the Russians appear ready to pull out all the diplomatic stops to push that plan through. Angus Roxburgh, BBC News, Moscow.
Polling finished this evening in the Bosnian Serb referendum on the Vance-Owen peace plan. The leader of the Bosnian Serbs, Radovan Karadzic, said tonight the peace plan was now dead. Although a ceasefire was signed today between Bosnian Serb and Croat leaders, there's been more heavy fighting throughout Bosnia, with Serbs, Croats and Muslims all trying to hold or gain territory. At Brčko, Serb forces have been fighting Muslims to widen the corridor which links Bosnian Serb areas. The UN would control it under the Vance-Owen plan.
Renewed fighting flared between Serbs and Muslims at the point where the supply corridor linking Bosnian Serb land with Serbia is at its narrowest. This was a Serb offensive to widen the corridor, United Nations observers believe. A destroyed village south of Brčko showed the Serbs had gained ground from the Muslims in this vital strip of land which the Vance-Owen peace plan would take from their control. Bosnian Serb fighters on the front line here had their chance to vote on the plan in the weekend referendum. Ammunition cases doubled as ballot boxes. The Serb army in the corridor claimed the Muslims had used the referendum as a chance to launch a surprise attack on them.
And it was an excellent chance for them to invade Brčko and to cut off the corridor. But on the other side, the defenders of the border, of the Serbian border here, succeeded and they stopped the invasion.
But for the Bosnian Serbs to still fall back on military force while their leaders go through the motions of democracy will only confirm the West's view that the referendum is another cynical delaying tactic. On another front, at Sarajevo airport, Serb and Croat commanders signed a ceasefire today covering the whole of Bosnia. UN General Filip Morion drew the two sides together. But the pact already signed between Serbs and Muslims has proved less than final. The polls have now closed in Serb-held Bosnia. Getting voting figures from the war zone means there'll be no official result until Wednesday. But peacemakers in the West needn't hold their breath. Mike Donkin, BBC News, Belgrade.
The ceasefire agreed by Bosnian Serb and Croat forces comes as fighting appears to be intensifying on other front lines in Bosnia. there's been more heavy fighting between Muslims and Croats in the southern city of Mostar. Some reports say the Croats are engaged in an all-out attack across the city, with hand-to-hand fighting on the streets.
The combat started at midday and was raging late into the evening, the fiercest yet in the 8-day battle for the city. It looked like a fight to the finish between Muslims and Croats. The principal battleground, the dividing line between the mainly Muslim east of the city and the Croatian west half, and the enclave which the Muslims hold on the west bank. The Croats had vowed to push them out within 5 hours. They had moved towards the front lines earlier with what was clearly more than a routine reinforcement. The men had red armbands as a recognition code. The Croats insisted it was the Muslims who had attacked first. The truth is hard to know, so are the casualties. These are certainly heavy, some seriously wounded, others dead on arrival. Both sides now are pressing their attacks as if their control of the city depended on it. The fighting is house to house and street by street. There are signs tonight it is spreading beyond Mostar, and earlier ceasefire agreements are quite meaningless. Martin Bell, BBC News, Split.
A murder inquiry has been launched by police in Lanarkshire after 2 incidents in which a man was found dead near Whitburn and 2 officers were wounded in an exchange of gunfire near Forth. The police later arrested a 29-year-old man who is now in hospital at Carluke.
The police shot the man in an exchange of fire after a car chase on the outskirts of the isolated Lanarkshire village of Forth. The police had lost the vehicle and officers, including members of Strathclyde's Tactical Firearms Unit, were waiting close to a remote farm track when they were ambushed by an armed man. The police shot back and he fell to the ground and was arrested. He's now in hospital following treatment for a chest injury. His condition said to be serious but not life-threatening. 2 officers hit by shotgun pellets have been discharged. Meanwhile, police are investigating the discovery of the body of a man with gunshot wounds in a lay-by close to a reservoir in West Lothian. As the body was removed, police confirmed they'd been alerted by a woman who was apparently thrown from a car. They're now trying to trace the movements of a black Ford Capri. Police won't say if the 2 shootings are connected, but have confirmed that a 4-day search for an armed man in the area has been called off. Andrew Castle, BBC News, Glasgow.
Cabinet ministers have been defending the Prime Minister and the government's record. The Home Secretary, Kenneth Clarke, said economic recovery and an end to the Maastricht row would enable the government to overcome its present difficulties. The Danish government is now predicting the Maastricht Treaty will be approved in their second referendum on Tuesday. The House of Commons has its vote on the treaty on Thursday.
While the Tory Eurosceptics stoke the fires of the Danish No campaign, ministers are becoming increasingly confident that the verdict on the second time of asking will be a decisive yes for the Maastricht Treaty. And that will remove one of the most hazardous obstacles from their path as they seek to revive the government's fortunes. But the streets of Copenhagen this weekend have been resounding to the sound of political scores being settled.
This small band of skeptics have been holding everything up month after month after month. These people are going to be hated for all time for what they've done to our party. And we saw the results in Newbury and we saw it in the counties up and down the country.
On Friday night, in what was billed as the Prime Minister's fight-back speech, he tried to lift his party's horizons beyond Maastricht. And today, for the second weekend running, ministers have been out in force, not only to talk up the economic prospects, but the Prime Minister's prospects too.
Don't forget that John Major almost single-handedly won the last general election. People trusted him. He will not let them down, and we will not let John Major down.
I'm quite sure John is going to remain leader for many years to come, and he is in the process, although the early stages, of emerging from the government's present difficulties.
4 cabinet ministers have leapt to the defence of the Prime Minister today. The clear strategy is to tackle head-on any talk of a whispering campaign against him. But it's a policy not without its dangers, for it keeps the issue of John Major's leadership in the headlines when what party managers want is a period of calm. John Sopel, BBC News, Westminster.
Standards of patient care are being undermined by staff shortages in Britain's hospitals, according to a survey by the Royal College of Nursing. The report, published on the eve of the college's annual congress in Harrogate, says many nursing posts are being left vacant, causing a fall in staff morale.
I'm just going to change the electrodes on your monitor, okay?
Okay, yeah.
Today's survey of 2,000 nurses reveals deep concern about staffing levels. More than half said vacancies are often left unfilled. 2/3 said they believed the numbers of qualified staff had been deliberately reduced. More worryingly, more than 60% said staffing levels in their areas were insufficient to provide adequate care. With unemployment among nurses rising, more than 3/4 said they felt worried about losing their jobs.
Nurses used to feel very safe in their jobs, and now many of them feel nervous. They can see nurses being made unemployed, not getting jobs, and indeed large numbers are getting letters saying their posts are at risk, and they don't actually know whether they'll be one of the ones made redundant or not. So it's very worrying for nurses at the moment.
But the Health Secretary said student nurses are finding jobs and patient care is being maintained.
Of course it's disappointing if you've trained and you can't immediately find a job. 5 out of 6 are finding a job, and that's very important. But the reason for this is because whereas a nurse used to stay with us an average of 7 years, she's now staying an average of 14 years, and the turnover has fallen. Well, that's good for patients.
Minister's assurances are, however, unlikely to calm nurses' fears. The recession has left many of them the sole family breadwinner, and the new NHS management freedoms have left exposed the more qualified and experienced nurses because they're more expensive to employ. This week, all the talk here will be about countering those concerns. Richard Hannaford, BBC News, Harrogate.
Wigan have failed in their attempt to be the first side to win all of Rugby League's 5 major trophies in one season. Their local rival St Helens beat them 10-4 in a thrilling Premiership final at Old Trafford. Saints finished the match more strongly, and a try by Paul Loughlin confirmed a victory they and their supporters will long remember. The British journalist Rebecca Stevens has begun her final ascent to the top of Everest. If she succeeds, she'll be the first British woman to reach the summit. Earlier, Harry Taylor, who last week reached Everest's peak without oxygen supplies, arrived back in London.
Rebecca Stevens has spent 15 months preparing for her ascent. There are few British women mountaineers, still fewer prepared to take on Everest. The weather conditions for her final push aren't ideal. The wind is beginning to gust and the temperature near the summit is around -38. Over the years, 19 climbers have lost their lives on this final stage.
That last 1,000 feet is critical. You've got a huge drop down straight into Nepal and a massive 10,000-foot drop down into Tibet. If there's a high wind, you can get blown off, and that's the danger.
Earlier today, Rebecca climbed 3,500 feet from Camp 2 to Camp 4, the South Summit. At 6 o'clock this evening, she began the final ascent. Around midnight, she'll stop within 1,500 feet of the summit and assess whether the conditions are safe enough to continue.
No, I haven't been worried, because I've got faith in the team. John Barry is a tremendous leader. They've got a backup, they've got superb Sherpas, and they've got wonderful communications.
Harry Taylor made it to the top of Everest last week, the first Briton to do so without oxygen from the treacherous Nepalese side. He arrived back at Heathrow today suffering the effects of frostbite.
It's quite an emotional experience, really, because, you know, it is the top of the highest point on the planet, and it just, it's quite a strong feeling.
Tomorrow, Rebecca Stevens could experience the same thing, standing on top of the world. Clive Myrie, BBC News.
Here's hope she makes it. Tonight's main news again. The Russians have said the Owen-Vance peace plan should be implemented, regardless of the result of the Bosnian Serb referendum. And that's the BBC News tonight. Good night.